Two Roman armies stare at each other across a Greek plain. One side has 22,000 men, the other has 45,000. Double. The cavalry difference is even worse, 1,000 against 7,000, 7 times outnumbered. By every military rule, the smaller side loses. But this is not an ordinary battle. These two generals were once allies, family by marriage, friends. Now only one side will survive this day. This is the year 48 BC. The Roman Republic, a system that lasted 500 years, is tearing itself apart from within. Rome had conquered the known world, from Spain to Syria, from Britain to Egypt. But now Romans are killing Romans, brother against brother. On one side stands Caesar. He spent 9 years conquering Gaul, modern France. His soldiers love him like a father and would die for him. Caesar is not just a general. He is a politician, a writer, an orator. He comes from an ancient family that claims descent from the goddess Venus. On the other side stands Pompey. They call him Magnus, meaning the Great. He cleared the Mediterranean of pirates in just 3 months. Pompey conquered the entire east for Rome: Armenia, Syria, Palestine. He reorganized the region and made Rome the dominant power in the world. These two men once ruled Rome together. Along with Crassus, they formed the first Triumvirate. 3 men sharing power over the greatest empire. But it was more than politics. Julia, Caesar's only daughter, was married to Pompey. These two powerful men were connected by blood and love. Pompey genuinely loved Julia. Ancient sources say he was devoted to her. For a brief moment, personal affection kept political ambition in check. Then Julia died in childbirth in 54 BC. The baby died too. The one bond that held Caesar and Pompey together was suddenly gone forever. 1 year later, Crassus died fighting the Parthians at Carrhae. His army was destroyed. His head was used as a prop in a Parthian play. Now only 2 men remained. 2 ambitious generals, each with loyal armies, each believing he should lead Rome. Conflict became inevitable. The Roman Senate feared Caesar. They saw him as a potential tyrant, another Sulla who might march on Rome and slaughter his enemies. They ordered Caesar to disband his army and return to Rome as a private citizen. If he obeyed, his enemies would prosecute him immediately. Caesar had 2 choices: surrender and face trial, possibly execution, or cross the Rubicon River with his army and start a civil war. The Rubicon was a small river in northern Italy. Roman law forbade any general from bringing troops across it. Crossing meant treason. So how did Caesar, outnumbered 2-to-1 in infantry and 7-to-1 in cavalry, manage to win this battle? The answer begins at that river. On January 10th, 49 BC, Caesar stood at the banks of the Rubicon with his 13th legion. He paused, thinking about what came next. Then he said something in Greek, not Latin. A quote from a comedy by Menander. "The die has been cast, not a war cry, a line from a play. This detail matters." Caesar was not just a soldier. He was one of the most educated men in Rome, fluent in Greek, well versed in literature. He crossed the river. There was no going back. The moment his boots touched the southern bank, he became an enemy of the Roman state. Caesar moved fast. Incredibly fast. City after city opened their gates without a fight. The people did not resist, many even welcomed him. Pompey was caught off guard. He had expected Caesar to negotiate, to delay. Instead, Caesar was racing toward Rome with terrifying speed. Pompey made a decision that surprised everyone. He abandoned Italy. He took his army and the Senate and sailed across the Adriatic to Greece. Many criticized this choice. How could Rome's greatest general flee without a fight? But Pompey had a plan. Italy was not the right battlefield. In Greece, Pompey could gather more troops from his eastern clients. He could use his superior navy to control the seas and starve Caesar out. Pompey wanted a war of attrition. He knew his soldiers were not as experienced as Caesar's Gallic War veterans. He needed time to train them. But the senators who followed him to Greece were not patient men. They were aristocrats, used to getting what they wanted immediately. They mocked Pompey. They called him a coward, said he was too old, accused him of prolonging the war to keep his command. Pressure mounted. One man in Pompey's camp deserves special attention. Titus Labienus, Caesar's most trusted lieutenant for 9 years in Gaul. Now a traitor, Labienus knew Caesar's tactics better than anyone. He had commanded the left wing in dozens of battles. He had won victories independently. Why did Labienus defect? Historians debate this. Some say loyalty to the Republic, others say jealousy. Caesar took all the glory in Gaul. Whatever his reasons, Labienus brought something valuable. 3,700 Gallic and Germanic cavalry, some of the best in the world. The man who taught Caesar how to fight would now use those same lessons against him. The student had become the enemy. Fate loves irony. In January 48 BC, Caesar did something no one expected. He crossed the Adriatic in winter, when storms made sailing extremely dangerous. He landed in Greece with 7 legions. Not his full force, but enough to threaten Pompey. His lieutenant Mark Antony would bring more later. Caesar marched to Dyrrachium, Pompey's main supply base on the coast. He tried to blockade it, to cut Pompey off from food and reinforcements. But Pompey had too many men, too many ships. The blockade lines were too long for Caesar's smaller army to hold. Gaps appeared everywhere. On July 7th, Pompey's forces broke through Caesar's lines. The battle turned into a disaster. Caesar lost about 1,000 men that day. It was Caesar's worst defeat in years. His army was exhausted, hungry, demoralized. For the first time, his soldiers doubted their invincible general. Caesar had no choice but to retreat. He marched his army inland, away from the coast, into the plains of Thessaly. He needed food and rest. Pompey followed. His generals and senators urged him to finish Caesar now, while he was weak. The hunters had become the hunters once more, but Pompey hesitated. He still preferred caution. Let Caesar starve, let his army melt away. Why risk everything in one battle? It made sense. The senators did not agree. They smelled blood. They wanted this over. They wanted to go home to Rome and resume their comfortable lives. The pressure on Pompey became unbearable. Eventually, he agreed to give battle. It was a decision he would not live long enough to regret. August 9th, 48 BC. The plain of Pharsalus in Thessaly, central Greece. 2 armies line up facing each other in the morning light. The Enipeus River flows to the south, protecting Pompey's right flank. Hills rise to the north. The terrain favors the larger army. But before we describe the battle, there is one detail that Caesar recorded with undisguised sarcasm in his own account of the war. Pompey's camp was already decorated for victory celebrations. Tents covered with ivy, silver plates laid out, as if the battle was already won. The senators had divided up the spoils before a single blow was struck. They argued over who would get Caesar's property after his defeat. This arrogance would cost them everything. They had no idea what was coming. They thought numbers guaranteed victory. They were wrong. Pompey's battle plan was simple and logical. His 7,000 cavalry would sweep around Caesar's right flank and attack from behind. The cavalry would destroy Caesar's smaller force, then roll up his infantry line. The battle would be over before it really began. For this plan to work, Pompey concentrated all his cavalry on his left wing. 7,000 horsemen, plus archers and slingers for support. Caesar's deployment. Mark Antony commanded the left with the 8th and 9th legions. Domitius Calvinus held the centre with 6 more legions. Caesar himself stood on the right with his beloved 10th legion, his best unit. Behind them, his 1,000 cavalry faced impossible odds. Pompey's deployment. He stood on the left with Labienus and all the cavalry. Metellus Scipio held the centre. Afranius anchored the right on the river. Caesar looked across the field and saw immediately what Pompey planned. All that cavalry massed on one side. The trap was obvious. He understood the danger. 1,000 cavalry could not hold against 7,000. When his right collapsed, his entire army would die. A lesser general might have despaired, The math was simple and brutal, but Caesar's genius was seeing what others could not see. In those few minutes before battle, Caesar made a decision that would change history. A decision that no one in Pompey's army anticipated. He pulled 6 to 8 cohorts from his third line, roughly 2,000 to 3,000 men, and formed them into a completely new fourth line. He positioned them at an angle behind his right flank, hidden from Pompey's view. They were his secret weapon, his ace in the hole. He gave them special instructions. Do not throw your javelins as you normally would. Use them as spears. Thrust upward. Aim for the faces. Why the faces? Because Pompey's cavalry were aristocrats, young nobles from Rome's best families. Vain men who cared about their appearance. Caesar reportedly said this to his men. Those pretty boys will not stand steel shining in their eyes. They will run to save their handsome faces. It was psychological warfare combined with tactical innovation. Caesar understood his enemy not just as soldiers, but as human beings. The trumpets sounded. The battle began. Both infantry lines advanced toward each other across the dusty plain of Thessaly. Something unusual happened. Pompey's infantry did not charge. They stood still, waiting for Caesar's men to come to them. A defensive stance, Pompey hoped that making Caesar's men run further would tire them out, fresh defenders against exhausted attackers. Sound logic, poor execution. Caesar's veterans noticed the enemy was not moving. Without orders, they stopped halfway, caught their breath, then continued the advance. These were experienced soldiers who had fought for 9 years in Gaul. They knew how to adapt, they would not waste their energy foolishly. The two infantry lines crashed together with a sound like thunder. Shields slammed against shields. Swords stabbed through gaps in armor. Meanwhile, on the flank, Labienus led his 7,000 cavalry in a thundering charge towards Caesar's right wing. The ground shook beneath them. Dust rose in clouds as thousands of horses galloped across the plain. This was the moment of decision. This was Pompey's winning move. Caesar's 1,000 cavalry met the charge, fought briefly, then gave ground. They were pushed back, exactly as Pompey had planned. Labienus pressed forward. His horsemen began to spread out, preparing to sweep around behind Caesar's infantry. Victory seemed certain now. The archers and slingers followed the cavalry advance, shooting into Caesar's ranks. Everything was going according to plan. Almost too easy. Then Caesar gave the signal. His fourth line rose from where they had been concealed. 2,000 men surged forward towards the enemy cavalry. The horsemen saw infantry charging directly at them and could not believe their eyes. This was against all rules of ancient warfare. Infantry did not attack cavalry. Everyone knew this. Cavalry had mobility, height advantage, momentum. Infantry in the open died against cavalry. But these were not ordinary infantry. These were Caesar's veterans, hand-picked for this mission, given specific orders for this exact moment. They did not throw their javelins. They ran straight into the mass of horsemen and began thrusting upward with their weapons like spears. The javelins stabbed at faces, at eyes, at those handsome aristocratic features that the young Roman nobles valued more than life itself. Panic spread through Pompey's cavalry like fire through dry grass. Horses reared and screamed, riders fell, formation dissolved into chaos. Within minutes, 7,000 cavalry were in full retreat. The greatest cavalry force in the Roman world fled from 2,000 foot soldiers. Labienus tried to rally his men. He had commanded cavalry for decades, but he could not stop the rout. His horsemen were running for the hills. The archers and slingers, now exposed without cavalry protection, were cut down. They had no armor, no heavy weapons. They died in hundreds. Pompey's left flank, which had been his strongest point, was now completely exposed. The trap had been sprung, but not the way he planned. Caesar's fourth line did not stop to celebrate. They wheeled right and slammed into the exposed flank of Pompey's infantry line. Imagine being a soldier in Pompey's front line. You are fighting the enemy in front of you. Suddenly, men are attacking from your left side. You cannot turn to face them without exposing your back to the enemy in front. You cannot retreat because men behind you block the way. At the same time, Caesar ordered his third line, held in reserve, to advance into the battle. Fresh troops against exhausted, demoralized men. Pompey's army began to crumble. The left wing collapsed first, then the center, then finally the right. Discipline broke down completely. Men threw down their weapons and ran. They ran toward their camp, towards the hills, anywhere that might offer safety from the slaughter. Pompey watched from a distance as his cavalry fled and his infantry died. According to Caesar's account, he seemed to lose all hope. Without saying a word, Pompey turned his horse and rode away from the battlefield. He went to his camp, changed clothes, and fled on horseback. The great Pompey Magnus, conqueror of the East, victor of 100 battles, abandoned his army and ran away. His spirit was broken. Caesar's men pursued the fleeing enemy to their camp and captured it. The tents with ivy decorations, the silver plates, all fell into their hands. Pompey's soldiers who escaped the battlefield gathered on nearby hills. Caesar surrounded them with 4 legions and cut off their water supply. The next morning they surrendered. 24,000 men laid down their arms and begged for mercy. Caesar granted it. He pardoned them all. The final count. Pompey's army lost about 15,000 dead and 24,000 captured. Caesar reported only 230 dead. Modern historians think Caesar's casualty figure is too low, probably propaganda. A more realistic estimate might be around 1,200. But even 1,200 against 15,000 is an extraordinary ratio. Caesar had achieved one of the most lopsided victories in Roman history. As the sun set over Pharsalus, Caesar walked across the battlefield. He saw the bodies of Roman senators lying among the common soldiers. These were men he had known, men he had worked with in the Senate, men who had chosen to fight against him rather than accept his rule. He said something that history recorded. They wanted this. Not gloating, not sarcasm, just a cold statement of fact about their choices. Caesar could have been merciful earlier. He had offered peace terms. They refused. They were so confident of victory. Now they were dead. The Battle of Pharsalus was over. But the story of Pompey was not finished yet. He was running east, hoping to find allies to fight again. Pompey fled to Mytilene on the island of Lesbos, where his wife Cornelia waited. She had hoped for news of victory. Instead, her husband arrived broken. They sailed together toward Egypt. Pompey had helped the previous Egyptian king reclaim his throne. Surely the son would return the favor. Egypt was ruled by Ptolemy XIII, a boy of 14 years. Real power rested with his advisors, especially a eunuch named Pothinus. Pothinus faced a difficult choice. Welcome Pompey and anger Caesar, or reject Pompey and break sacred laws of hospitality. Both options dangerous. He chose a third option. Welcome Pompey, then kill him. Present his head to Caesar as a gift. Surely the victor would appreciate this gesture. On September 28, 48 BC, a small boat rowed out to Pompey's ship. They said the harbour was too shallow for large vessels. Pompey's wife and friends begged him not to go. Something felt wrong. Why send such a small boat? Why so few men? He did not listen. On the boat was Septimius, a Roman officer who had once served under Pompey in the Eastern campaigns. Pompey recognized him and asked a question. "Were you not once my fellow soldier?" Pompey asked. Septimius nodded once, saying nothing. Then he drew his sword and stabbed Pompey from behind. The other men on the boat joined in with their daggers. Pompey pulled his toga over his face, saying nothing, doing nothing, undignified. Plutarch writes that Pompey died as a Roman noble should, accepting his fate with silent dignity even as he was betrayed by his own people. Pompey Magnus was 58 years old. He died one day before his birthday. The conqueror of the East, killed by servants of a child king. They cut off his head and kept it to present to Caesar. They left his body on the beach. A former slave cremated it later that night. A few days later, Caesar arrived in Egypt with a small force. He had pursued Pompey across the Mediterranean, hoping to end the war. Ptolemy's advisors presented Pompey's head, expecting gratitude. They had removed Caesar's greatest enemy. Surely a reward would follow. Caesar turned away in disgust. When they gave him Pompey's signet ring, he began to weep. Whatever Pompey had become, he was once family. The assassination backfired completely. Instead of winning Caesar's favor, Ptolemy and his advisors earned his contempt. This had consequences. Caesar became involved in the Egyptian civil war between Ptolemy and his sister Cleopatra. He supported Cleopatra. Ptolemy died in the fighting. The people who murdered Pompey to please Caesar were themselves destroyed by Caesar. The gods of irony must have been laughing that day. Cleopatra became Queen of Egypt with Caesar's support. Their relationship became one of the most famous love affairs in all of history. Caesar stayed in Egypt longer than he should have. Some say he was enchanted by Cleopatra. Others say he was trapped by the situation. Eventually, he left to continue mopping up Pompey's remaining supporters. There were still battles to fight in Africa and Spain. The civil war officially ended in 45 BC, but Caesar's victory at Pharsalus was the decisive moment. Everything after was just aftermath. 4 years after Pharsalus, Caesar stood at the peak of his power. He was dictator for life, the most powerful man Rome had ever seen. Then, on March 15, 44 BC, he was stabbed to death in the Senate by men who claimed they wanted to save the Republic. Among the assassins was Brutus, a man Caesar had pardoned after Pharsalus, a man Caesar may have believed was his own illegitimate son. The conspirators thought killing Caesar would restore the Republic. Instead, it triggered another civil war, more death, more destruction. Eventually, Caesar's adopted son Octavian defeated all rivals and became Augustus, the first Roman emperor. The Republic was truly dead. The Battle of Pharsalus marked the end of 500 years of republican government and the beginning of 500 years of empire. One battle on a Greek plain changed the course of Western civilization. The decisions made that day still echo through history. The phrase crossing the Rubicon survives in languages around the world. 2,000 years later, we still use it to mean passing the point of no return. And what about Labienus? He fled after Pharsalus, continued fighting against Caesar in Africa and Spain, and died at the Battle of Munda in 45 BC. According to one ancient source, his head was brought to Caesar after the battle. Caesar had him buried with full honours. Enemies, but once friends. The story of Pharsalus teaches us something important. Numbers and resources do not guarantee victory. Strategy and adaptability matter more. Caesar won with fewer men because he understood his enemy. He predicted exactly what Pompey would do and prepared a counter that no one expected. He also understood human psychology. He knew those aristocratic cavalry would not endure javelins aimed at their beautiful faces. He was right, but perhaps the most important lesson is about political arrogance. The senators were so confident, so certain of victory, that they decorated their tents early. That arrogance blinded them. They pressured Pompey into a battle he did not want to fight. Their confidence caused their own destruction.